Good evening. Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for our author talk featuring author Prince Shakur. Tonight, he will be in discussion of his new book, When They Tell You to Be Good, a memoir. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I am an adult services specialist for the library. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator and author for tonight. Our moderator is Brandon M. Bradley. He is a Central Florida native, born and raised in Sanford, Florida. Brandon received his Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing Fiction from the University of Central Florida and is currently a lead creative writing coach at Page 15, a youth literacy and empowerment nonprofit serving the Paramore community in Orlando, Florida. He is passionate about creating and sharing stories that highlight and reflect the multi-layered lives of African Americans. As an aspiring children's and youth adult author, Brandon seeks to, through his writing, offer the kind of representation he sought in literature as a child. Tonight's author is Prince Shakur. Prince Shakur is a queer Jamaican American author, freelance journalist, video maker, and New York Times recognized organizer. His writings range from op-eds in Teen Vogue to features on the violent impacts of policing and cultural essays that delve into Black icons like Bob Marley or Huey Newton. In 2017, his video series, Two Woke Minds, earned him the Rising Star Grant from GLAAD. As an organizer, he brought Black Lives Matter to his university campus, did migrant caravan support work, and was a lead organizer with Black, Queer, and Intersectional Collective in Columbus, Ohio. His work, whether literary, visual, or grassroots, is steeped in his commitment to Black liberation, prison abolition, and queer resilience. Please welcome Brandon M. Bradley and Prince Shakur.
Thank you. Hey, friends, how's it going?
I'm good. I'm glad to be talking to you.
I
Glad
know
to
I'm really, really
reconnect
excited for
here.
this. When I got asked a couple months ago, I was just thrilled. Just for a little bit of context, to the audience, Prince and I met last summer during the Hurston Wright Foundation Writers Week in Washington, D.C. And I remember when you came into the room and you were kind of like, you were very humble about it, probably more humble than I would have been, but you were like, oh, by the way, I have a book coming out in
Ah.
October.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, like, what are you even doing here with us? So it's really cool I have my signed copy here. It's really cool to have When They Tell You to Be Good and to be in the space to talk to you about it tonight. So before I ask my first question, I wanted to read a paragraph from your acknowledgement section, actually, if that's okay. There's so much of this book. I wish I could it's one of those things where like you're highlighting stuff you love, you want to just dip the whole book in yellow because so much of the book was that, but just to kind of frame how to frame talking about how you wrote the book and why you decided to write it. The first paragraph in your acknowledgement says, I wrote this memoir because at some point I feared I would always be the boy grappling for a father who had done wrong. Through writing, I confronted this fallacy and came out the other end, a little more realized and grateful for my body, my heart, my mind, and all of the people who love me and ask questions. I want to acknowledge a 12-year-old boy who was assigned to write a short story and started a new life with his pen. Many parts of this book challenged me to have the courage to make sense of a complicated life as best as I could. So many people believe that young Black people don't have stories to tell, but this book proves we do. I honestly think that's one of the most endearing acknowledgments I've read. I think I relate to it a lot because of in the book we see you pull that 12-year-old into a lot of different spaces. And so I think I felt it. It wasn't just you saying it to be cute or have this great acknowledgement aesthetic. I think I felt it. So after hearing that, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this memoir and what challenges you faced in doing so?
Yeah. First, thank you on mentioning that acknowledgement because it's really important to me, and it was really important for me to especially include that part about saying that young people have stories because I think through the process of writing this book and then getting it published, there's a lot of ageism out there, and I really want to advocate that everyone deserves to write, everyone deserves to tell their story. But to your question, which was about the inspiration and how I got into writing the book, I would say, whew, I would say it really started in 2016. I was a year out of graduating college. My senior year was when Black Lives Matter started. I was huge into student organizing. I moved to Seattle after college and was a labor organizer. So I was very new to post-college adulthood and also taking seriously a lot of the questions that are in the book, which is like, how do you be Black in this world? How do you navigate being at all these intersections? How do you practice and embody anti-capitalism? And so that drove me into a lot of different spaces. I was working in Montana as a housekeeper. I like left Seattle. I went to France for the first time, went to my first riot. I moved back to Ohio. It was the 2016 election. I quit another job. Um, I interrupted a Bill Clinton speech. I went to Standing Rock and was in solidarity with the water protectors there and all of the indigenous people that came there to protect sacred land. And through all of that, I think I was really exposed to and traumatized by how anti-Blackness showed up in adulthood and how wage exploitation showed up and seeing state violence. And it really gave me this deep sense of mortality. And that led me to questions about my father, about how he passed away, about why I didn't know as much as I felt like I could. And I think sometimes when you're young and you're going through traumatic experiences and you don't think you have much time left, which is what I thought then, it kind of forces you to look at the questions you'd like to answer before you're not here anymore. And so I started thinking a lot about what would it be like to write a book about my dad or about my feelings around him. And then in all of these experiences, I also went to the Philippines that year. And so I think I just crammed a lot of life into like a year and a half slash those years after college. And it really compelled me to take seriously how dangerous living boldly as like a Black gay person is and how enlightening it could be, and how I felt like I hadn't read a book that acknowledged these things, acknowledged what a softer kind of masculinity could look like, or acknowledged how I, as a man, have a lot of criticisms of other men of masculinity and the patriarchy. And I wanted to do all of that work in a way that could kind of rival whatever time I had on this earth. And luckily, a lot of my ideas about my mortality have been proven wrong. But I think it just really made me really seriously look at my life and think, I haven't read something like this, and this deserves to be out there. And I'm at the intersection of all these things. And I think what made me realize I needed to write it is that it all sounded so challenging. I was like, how do I write a book about my dad and my life and my family and all these other things? And through the process, I figured out how to do it. And I learned things along the way that changed the book. But it was really that year because I was going to my first riots, getting beaten up by police, falling in love, doing all these things, and also realizing the world is also trying to kill me. So what am I going to do in reaction to that?
That's a great response. I think like you have packed so much life into what, like under 300 pages, I want to say. Like we're just under 300 pages. And um I don't think, I mean, I know you just had a birthday, but I don't even think you're 30 years old yet. And so I think it's like it's amazing to see the way that you've navigated those experiences. And I think it's one thing to live through those, but then to like write them in such a beautiful way that other people can then take that and like learn from it or whatever. It's just, it's even more impactful from like a writing standpoint. What did writing look like? Like, did you kind of start from page one, or was it like you had journal entries that you had kind of been recording from while you were living through these experiences? Like, what was the writing process like?
It was a lot. It was a lot of different things. I mean, initially I had to figure out what the shape of it would be, and initially I thought I want to write a double memoir, a memoir about my life and my dad's life, and then I realized, oh, that's going to take a long time to research. And then as I was leaving the Philippines and sort of thinking about more and getting into my freelance writing career, I knew I kind of wanted it to be more shaped around myself, but related to my father. And then I was kind of writing the beginnings of it, figuring out the shape, figuring out, do I want to write from birth until now? Do I want to include everything? I started making a timeline of my life and thinking of chapters of my life and what those represented. And so some of that gave me the shape. But in 2018, I went to France for 3 months because I was turning 24 and I knew that James Baldwin went to France when he was 24. So I was like, I'm going on this little pilgrimage. And it was there that I learned about this uncle that I never knew that I had, who is my biological father's brother. And so the news of him was really confusing, really devastating, really heartbreaking. And I think that that was the point where I started to take the book more seriously. I started to realize there are deeper questions here that I have a responsibility to answer if I care about what the truth is. And so I'd say around that point, I had maybe 10 to 15,000 words written. And from there, I moved back to Ohio. I started going to artist residencies. I remember at my first artist residency, I wrote about half of the book there. All the while I'm researching, I'm watching documentaries, I'm watching movies related to Jamaica's early independence days and Jamaica's history. I'm learning about Tivoli Gardens and Michael Manley and Bob Marley. And I'm really just trying to soak in as much as I can because a really important thing for me was to situate the book in my experience as a Black person, but also in my family's history in Jamaica and how so much of colonialism and post-independence, it crafted a lot of these gender politics that I grew up with in Black communities, but in a Jamaican family. And so I was doing a lot of research, I was writing a lot, just like learning as much as I could. The uncle that I never knew about that I learned about in 2018, his name is Cedric Murray. I learned that he had a diary that the police knew about and journalists knew about. And so I made it a priority to try to find that. And about a year and a half into writing the book, I got copies of those pages. And so that's a part of the book as well. But a lot of it was figuring out what I wanted to say about my childhood or masculinity or the political world that I lived in, and then figuring out what chapters of my life represented that. And yeah, I mean, initially the book opened with the scene where I come out to my mother, and later that day she takes me to this parking lot, and it's really kind of scary for me. But when I sold the book to Tin House, Hanif Abdurraqib wanted to take the book out of order because from that point on, I kind of go from my life from the beginning to the end. And he was like, let's look at what it would look like if this were a book of mini memoirs. What would these sections represent? And he kind of gave me free reign to work on that. But in terms of like the actual content, I'd say like the earlier stuff, the earlier ages came a lot easier, even though it was kind of emotionally difficult to go back. But I'd say a lot of the parts about Jamaica and my father and Cedric, those were the most challenging parts to write because I wanted to get those parts as close to kind of the emotional truth and the sort of socio-political truth of what happened. And I wanted to do that really well.
That's awesome. I love hearing about the travel part, especially too, because I think that for me, anyways, in writing anything, place is always a challenge. And so one of the things that I remember when I saw you at AWP, and I was like, "Are you cold?" Because I'm cold, and you were like, "Well, I lived in Seattle for a year, so it's fine." And I was like, "Of course, Prince lived in Seattle." But I think that you like beautifully articulate the movement across different landscapes and like attaching to those landscapes what you were experiencing and how those things felt. You mentioned your mother, and family is obviously like such a big part of this memoir, family and relationships with family members. um Writing a memoir, writing any kind of nonfiction is a vulnerable experience, I think. And so I'm curious about what it has been like for you in this. We're close to a year, I would say, probably about like 9 or 10 months into since the memoir has been published. What has it been like navigating these relationships now that like you have put out so much of what you've experienced with these people? Have they read the memoir? Have they given you reactions to it? Like, what has it been like kind of navigating that new chapter?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because I set certain boundaries with different family members. Like, I don't really share a lot of my intimate life with my family. And I think a lot of that is literally just the post coming out trauma and how I protect myself. So, I mean, I don't really talk about my writing career that much with my family, but some of them do know about it. I've had some family members read it. I know that some people don't love it. That's fine. I did my research. I didn't lie about anything, and anything that's in there about my family is what I experienced or what I could read online. And yeah, and I have a family member that read it and was really curious about why I wrote it, and we talked about it. And I mean, it was a very healing moment for me, but they said, yeah, some people in the family might not agree with how you wrote about things, or they might not agree with your perspective, but what you're writing can help people. And so I think in a lot of ways that's been unexpected. I think some of the reactions that people have had to the book, it's challenged me almost to like open up or challenge myself to open up or ask questions about what boundaries I set and why. But I think the reactions I've enjoyed the most have been the ones from friends, like chosen family, people that know me a lot more deeply, because it's interesting having people bear witness to certain parts of my life, but now people have access to kind of what is a sort of totality of it, or what represents a totality. And I think that to me is interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting going on dates and people can read your book about your life. And it's, I don't know, it's all interesting.
Well, I hope before a date they're doing their homework, or
Ugh,
maybe not do don't do their
no,
homework
no,
until
no, no. I
after.
hope they're
Yeah.
not doing their homework.
So kind of at the mention of family again, I know I said this earlier, but like I really just was kind of obsessed with like moments where we get 12-year-old Prince. And so like kind of a two-part question, but like I think some of those moments are so vivid because you carefully handle the language, and I just couldn't forget because of how impressionable there was. And so the moment that like one moment I'll say that I really loved is when you talk about the spelling bee when you were in middle school. I'm gonna read a little quick, another small excerpt. I'm sorry. I really wish I could read the whole book because it's worth it. But so at the bottom of 142, my mother, busy with work and bills, didn't have time to grasp that the experience had rocked me. Arriving at the auditorium in a suburb and feeling like Aquila from Aquila and the Bee, as I stared out at all the white faces. Then the humiliating, then the humiliation of losing and no one in my family being aware enough to pry about how I had done. It was hard to distinguish if I had wanted to be seen and supported, told the truth and left alone, or have a family with the capacity to help me navigate failure. And then like you kind of go into being in eighth grade and like dealing with like guys being weird in locker rooms and that kind of thing. But there's like one line that like sucker punched me. I was 13. I was a 13-year-old puppet on a massive shit stained strings. And so I was like, Prince, like, come on, like let me breathe. I think I love this moment for several reasons. I think like number one, it's hard to, for me anyways, recall some of those moments because they are traumatic, but also because it's been a while, right? Like you haven't been in that space in a long time. But you do it in such a way that is really profound and it like doesn't miss a detail. I mean, even like you're Aquila from Aquila and the Bee, and like this is a moment that if you watch TV or BET at any point in your life, you know this movie, you know the feeling that Aquila had when she was on that stage. So like we are
Kiki
immediately like in the
Palmer.
moment with you. How did you approach like these moments like this with so much detail? And I think like the thing too is that in nonfiction discussions, people are always basically saying like you have to take certain liberties or like you fabricate certain things because you don't remember it as clearly as maybe you portray it. So like how did you navigate moments like this? And anything else that you want to add to just the 12-year-old Prince?
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because that was one of the harder sections to write, because it's like you're entering teenage years, and that was really when the bullying started. And I was like, who am I? And it was just very, I look back at middle school especially, and I feel really intensely sad and protective to that version of me. And I think that's why that section reads that way, because writing this book, I know I've been through these things, but writing it, I had to re-acknowledge the intensity of so many of the things that I experienced. Um, a lot of those younger years, like I definitely had a very mixed childhood. Like I know that I was taken care of. I know that things were very intense. I know it was very dysfunctional. Um, and I think going back forces you to really try to embody what you felt and saw and knew at the time. And what I felt and saw and knew at the time was, I don't have anyone in my life I can talk to about these deepest feelings that I have. My stepdad is in jail. Like all these things are changing at home. And I just remember feeling this intense loneliness and wanting to really figure out if I could make friends in high school that I could trust, if I could find that community, if I could come out and figure out how to be more of myself. And I think, I don't know, maybe it's just how I was born or the cancer energy in me or being an empath because of childhood, whatever. But it's like, I can remember as a kid, like elementary school, like sometimes just crying for no reason or having just like nameless bouts of emotion. And I think the way that masculinity trains us as boys is like it beats that out of you. It teaches you not to feel that much. It teaches you to put it in a like legible space. And going back and looking at that 12-year-old, I realized that was kind of the point in my life where I had to decide, am I going to be this kind of boy or this kind of boy or whatever I am? And I wanted to honor the level of intense emotional work I did. Like I think, I don't know. It's like there's no one in my life that I'm actively around other than family that can really understand that part of me. And so I really had to look back and think like, I don't know, a part of writing that stuff was an act of love to my past self. Like, thank you for surviving. Thank you for dealing with this. Like I don't know how you did it, but I'm gonna tell the truth. And I think all of that just means like it's burnt so intensely into my mind. It's when I started asking myself questions about the kind of person I wanted to be, how I wanted to show up in the world. And so much of that is in my mind clearly. And also like around that time, I think that was around the time Aquila and the Bee came out. So I'd probably seen that movie like 4 times through school and programs because Black people always wanted to take you to see that movie to teach you how to win a spelling bee. And so some of those things are just there because it was just really a part of that time. But yeah, I just wanted to honor what I went through. And I think that's exactly why I say like young people deserve to tell stories because that was around the time that I realized I have all these stories in my head and no one to tell them to. So I'll just write them down, tell them to the page, tell them to the internet. And so in a way, maybe like 12-year-old me, it's like I set the foundation for who I am now. So it's like, I don't know, I love that version of me because he went through all that trash. I don't know. Yeah.
I
Great
love
question.
I love that you say that it was like an act of love to your 12-year-old self because I think like middle school is hard. Middle school is those were like the worst school
Yeah.
years for me. Like it's a tough period, and I think you definitely do that. You so beautifully and so delicately. I think that's the thing too. Like you were so delicate with your 12-year-old self, and like you were able to really bring that version of yourself's experiences to the page and kind of just leave them there and like allow them to tell their story. But I think it's a beautiful thing to give space to like to an experience that you had that wasn't pleasant. It was painful. It was like traumatic. So I think it's easy to be able to like push all that down. But like it's kind of that like cliche about writing where it can be so therapeutic and like in revisiting that place of your life and like kind of paying homage to who you once were. I think that in many ways you allow yourself to do some healing work and give that version of yourself a space to look at like where Prince is now, which is like just getting started. I mean, you are on your way for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it just reminds me that it's important to revisit our experiences and not to be beholden to the past, but I don't think I've really had the space to really reflect and heal on those years of my life, other than like maybe therapy in high school and maybe like conversations with friends. But it's like those things were deeply traumatic. And it's like, how many of us have gone through things when we were kids where you maybe figured it out in some way, but you didn't really get the space that you really needed to work through it. And that's important when you're coming of age.
I think too, especially too, like your book is so much about the intersectionality of so many different things. And so like being not only a Black person, but being part of an immigrant family, but then being a queer person, like you have all of these intersections. And I think in so many of those layers, like we are taught by society, by family, and just conditioned to not feel, to not experience emotions that like are present in our lives. So I think for that reason as well, it's just really impactful to see the way you revisit those moments of your life. I want to talk about, oh, sorry, we're gonna say something.
Um, no, you go.
Oh,
You're
sorry.
good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk about influences. You mentioned, so in me reading this, I thought a lot about Jessamine Ward's memoir because she discusses death a lot, and I think she handles death delicately, and I think you do it similarly in your book. And I couldn't stop thinking about her like in this. But you mentioned James Baldwin and being in France at 24, the same way that he was. So can you talk to us about like some of your literary influences and how they've impacted your writing career in general, or this memoir? How do they come to the forefront for you?
Yeah, I mean, both people you mentioned are definitely big influences. I mean, Baldwin definitely. I did a residency last year in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, France, which is where he lived for the last 17 years of his life. And I mean, he's just definitely a reference because I'm like, there's definitely queer men and gay men and bisexual men throughout, I guess, like the black canon or milieu, whatever. But he's just kind of what represented, I guess, what I most wanted to embody. And I'm glad I read him and learned about him right after college because it kind of guided me to live more boldly or to live a big life, as I think he says. Or he also says, like, I was listening to his conversation with Maya Angelou, and he says, like, you have to trust life. Like, you have to trust life. And I think that comes with, like, you have to acknowledge the things that you want in life and make them happen or find a way to get there. And so he's definitely an influence, like, I think just as a person, but also writing wise. I think the way he moves through the sort of national and bird's eye political space into the personal is something that I revere and always want to embody in my work. Jasmine Ward, I mean, I read um, The Men We Reaped, and that was a big reference text because I loved how she moved through time and childhood, and death was kind of a presence in the book. And I can kind of say the same for like Saidiya Hartman, and how what I take from her work is like a deep reverence for history, but also the ways that our real and lived political lives are related to history, and also how imagination is like a necessary part of the Black archive. Because in researching a lot for this book and trying to learn more about my family, a lot of my family, a good amount of them were undocumented and have been deported or spent time in jail. And so the record or the genealogy of what you can search isn't so clear. And so I had to be really creative about how I made these timelines, how I looked at history, and it gave me so much respect for like a scholar and like researcher and writer like her. Um, and I mean, other writers, I mean, I'd say Kiese Layman, who wrote a memoir called Heavy, and he talks a lot about revision and how it's important for uh, any artist, but especially Black artists, to really understand the value of your work and not be undersold, which I thought about a lot when this book was on submissions, and I wasn't sure if it was going to sell. Um, yeah, and I'd say so those are some of the bigger kind of pillars of what I wanted to write about. And then like another text that I've read since this book has come out, Afropean is like a essay collection by this Black writer who's writing about visiting different European cities and looking at the Black history and perspective. And even reading that, I kind of see things in that that I want to embody, or I try to embody in how I write about travel, which is having like a really critical approach, but also being extremely emotionally driven and having a sense of consciousness to how you portray or look at a place. Because definitely growing up and visiting Jamaica, but staying there in summers, I got to see a lot of how tourism was really extractive and transactional. And so when I travel, I try to be conscious. And when I write about my traveling, I try to also be conscious too. And so those are all kind of things that I try to embody. And it's interesting because if I look at my early 20s, there's also a lot of writers that I love then. And I'm like, oh, I'm writing in the opposite strain of that because I was really into the beatniks and Kerouac and Bukowski. And now I'm like, oh, I'm kind of trying to be the antithesis of these things that got me interested in traveling.
That's really cool though. I mean, it's a journey. Like it's I think what is also really cool is like just how I don't know that I've ever like I think getting to talk to you like one on one, I guess now, even though we have an audience about the book, like I'm really seeing just the fullness of like how well read you are and like how much everything, like I think it's one thing to like read your book and to see like the layers, but then to like talk to you and like really feel it, I guess, in a different way is really cool. I want to ask you about how, so right now America is a disaster. It's a hot mess. It's been that way for a while, let's just be honest. But we have book bans, we have the Supreme Court being, I'm gonna just keep it PG-13, but being just really terrible right now. Like
They're
there's
rolling back a lot of rights and fascism is on
yes,
the rise.
yes. Thank you for proper articulation, Prince. in this current world, where do you hope that when they tell you to be good fit into these conversations? I think obviously from my lens, like I think that this book is going to inspire so many people, both young and old, of all genders, of all sexualities. I think that this is kind of like a book to ignite a fire and to like tell them that they do have a story to be told. But like what is your hope of where this book will find itself in the world?
That's a good question. Uh, uh, I mean, I think of a few different things. I think about different age ranges. I definitely know for younger people or people that are coming up or people in their 20s or people that are curious and young about like social movements. I definitely want this book to be one of many blueprints that I hope are out there for younger people to navigate being pressured by your family, to navigate loneliness, to navigate college or not going to college or traveling or trying to live your life in your way. Because in a lot of the conversations I've had since the book has come out, I've always appreciated how I get the chance to tell young people that you don't have to have everything figured out. And sometimes you should be figuring out what you're against in this world, what you don't accept, what your boundaries are. And so I hope this book is a piece of that. And I hope it shows that there are young people out there that are throwing down and and going against the state and taking it seriously. Like I don't, and I couldn't write nearly everything on a political level, but I just wanted to let young people know like it is so important to get out there, whether it's through mutual aid or doing projects from your home or whatever it is, like go into the world and experiment because that is how we're going to save ourselves. And then I think for older people, I hope that this book is kind of a snapshot of what young people are experiencing right now or have experienced over the last 20 or 30 years. I hope it gives people empathy that might not understand the Black experience or especially the queer experience. And I say that because I've gone to book events and it's been so stirring to have older people congratulate me and show me love in ways that I always wished I could receive from my family. And so I think for older people, I just hope it humanizes young people and what we go through and why we might be so angry at the world. And I was reading Walter Rodney earlier and reading about his approaches and ideas around Pan African Marxism. And he talked about how it's important for any ideology to be adapted or understood through a particular context. And so I want it with this book for it to be a tool for people to understand the Black radical and sort of anarchist or like diasporic kind of context. I hope it adds to that language and that vernacular. I hope maybe this book can be a part of like critiquing and finding a body of thought around being critical of masculinity. Like I wanted to do all of those things. I wanted to show people like you don't have to travel just for a week in another place and say that you knew it intensely. Like stay there longer, quit your job, don't go to college, go traveling instead. Like find your options in life. And I feel like when I was writing this book, I kept thinking like, oh, it seems like I'm making all the same mistakes again. But I think if I'm giving myself grace and I'm giving the people that I want to read this book grace, it's like we have an entire life. Like make the mistakes you need to learn, experiment, and have that be a part of how you resist this messed up world that you got born into. Because that's all I can do. And I really hope this book encourages other people to do that too.
I would say you are like preaching to me right now, just in my current chapter of life. But I also would say, like, as an educator, I work mostly with like elementary level, but I think it's always cool to have books because you come across so many different kinds of students, and I'm like waiting so patient for the moment that I find this student who I know needs when they tell you to be good. Because I can be
Mm.
like, I got some medicine for you. I got something
Yeah.
that'll inspire you and just pass it along. But I think that everything that you said, I think that this book is definitely doing, and I think over time, I mean, I look at the impact from under a year. I think that over time, as it continues to circulate through the hands of young people and old people and just people who want to be inspired, want to learn more about the world, is going to accomplish everything that you said. I remember seeing when you first opened the box of books, when you first got your I guess there were like maybe advanced copies, but I remember seeing it on your Instagram. But then I was
Yeah.
doing a little bit of homework prior to this, and I was like, wait, Prince had an entire playlist on his YouTube channel that was documenting his publishing experience. And so like it went way back to when you sold the book and when you turned down other book deals, like you documented so much of this. I would say maybe a year and a half to 2 years prior to the book coming out. And I think it's interesting that you chose to do these through video diaries because obviously as a writer, you could have done blog post or like a Twitter thread. So I wanted to ask about like why you chose these video diaries, and why you wanted to document this experience in the first place, publishing your book.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I've documented a little bit of like my newsletter. I have a newsletter where I share like writing resources, but I definitely did make YouTube an effort. One, because when I went to the Philippines in 2016 and 17, I kind of went to work on this YouTube series with my best friend Eli. And since then, I've kind of been working and dabbling into YouTube and in the author tube space. I don't know if I've seen any black guys. And I think maybe I've seen like a handful, but on that level, I knew it was important for me to just be sustained in my process of documenting different parts of the writing journey because I'm like, I want there to be at least some assemblage of visibility of black men that are writers that want to talk about it or share resources or things. And I think some of that is different for other social media spaces. But I definitely took that seriously. And I just think with the video, I am really interested in film and filmmaking. I made my first short film earlier this year. And with YouTube, I always feel like, okay, I'm doing one thing and I'm learning how to video edit it and how to turn these videos into something I can put online. But I always kind of viewed it as a stepping stone. Um, and I'm also very much a sentimental, nostalgic person. Like when I'm drunk, I'll go on my own Instagram and look at old photos of myself and be like, oh, so proud of it. It's just like it's in me. So I also love the process of knowing that I'm documenting things that I'm going to appreciate looking back on later. And I've also looked back at some of those videos and I've been like, oh, I forgot that. Or even recently, I had a friend tell me like, yeah, I remembered when we were in Columbus together and your book wasn't selling and we met up for karaoke and you were really sad. You just said you told me you were admitting that your dream was never going to happen. And I was like, I said that. And so it's also just important to kind of, I don't know, like debunk my own version of history in a way, which I think is what um I guess a memoir can kind of do, and I guess these videos, because I can look back and be like, oh yeah, that's actually how that kind of happened. Yeah, it was honestly fun. Like, I mean, a lot of it was sad. Like the earlier debut diaries videos, I'm like, you need pandemic therapy, which I got. But yeah, it's all of those things.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. Because again, I remember like after meeting you and learning that you had a book coming out, we saw like on Instagram or Twitter, whatever, that you like had it. But then when I went back there, I was like, I have some catching up to do because I think it'd just be really cool. I think it's really impactful too for writers and creators in general to kind of watch that journey and see that like while we can might like come across your Instagram or and see like, oh my God, Prince is so successful and is doing so great. I think that there's a different kind of vulnerability, I think, to seeing the videos where like there are moments where you cry and like you're really like in the thick of it, and then we all see the beautiful moments. So I think it really shows all sides of artistry in a way that we don't always see. I know we're moving close to time for our Q&A. I think the last thing I wanted to mention, so I'm gonna give you kind of like a shameless plug. I've been watching that you are taking on more of like a teacher hat lately. So I know you have, I think you like been doing some college work. You have a couple of panels that are coming up, and I hope that you'll mention them so that the audience is aware of like what you have coming up. But I know you also this summer I was returning to the Hurston Wright Foundation Writers Workshop to lead their nonfiction workshop. So I was wondering if there was any piece of advice you could give to writers, nonfiction, fiction, writing career, craft, publishing, anything that you think is a strong takeaway. What would be the one thing you would say to writers?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say biggest piece of advice is writing wise, fall in love with the process. When the business side of it is hard, or editing, or revision, or all the things outside of writing is hard, like fall in love with the process of writing. Because if you do that, then you'll have a finished draft, and then you could figure out how you revise and figure out how you want to get an agent. But I think falling in love with the act of writing and the different parts of it and knowing what you like about it or why, that is so important because it sustains you when things are really hard for whatever other reasons. I would also say make yourself as searchable as you can online, whether that's posting your little blog or your newsletter or having your name and your writing just accessible on different platforms. I think is another piece of advice, especially if you're building a platform or you're building towards wanting to be traditionally published. And I would say also just find literature, art that you love that you can go back to when you have writer's block or things are hard. I read Call Me by Your Name every year by Andre Aciman. I read Giovanni's Room every year by James Baldwin. I watch Titanic once a year. Like I have these rituals that kind of remind me, I guess, of times in my life where I read something and I'm like, oh, crap, I didn't know people could tell stories like this. And so I think that's also a part of falling in love with the process. Like find things that remind you why you like storytelling in the first place. And then I think in terms of getting into the industry and figuring things out, when you're finding an agent or an editor, um, try to be really clear about what the things that you're concerned about or worried about or that make you anxious about the sort of traditionalism of the process or how corporate it can feel. Because I look at each step of the way and I know, like, with the agent I have now, I was very upfront, like, it's been difficult selling this book. I don't trust people in the industry. Here are the reasons why. And based on how they responded, I got to see, like, oh, they actually see and acknowledge what I'm going through. So I think being vulnerable sometimes in how you show up can help you make a better business decision and also a better creative decision when it relates to your business. Yeah, and I would just say like stay and try to be inspired. Like figure out what inspires you and go back to it again and again. Don't be afraid of it. Yeah.
Cool, that was so great. I mean, definitely taking notes for myself to you have no idea how much you've inspired me just in this like short time to especially I think coming out of graduation, I'm kind of in a funk right now where I'm like, I don't have deadlines anymore.
Yeah.
What is life like? So I think I just really appreciate your candidness and your authenticity and vulnerability in this conversation. We're gonna now take some questions from the audience. So I'll just read off questions. If anyone that is viewing has any questions, please feel free to use our Q&A or our chat. So in the chat, the first question I see is, what do you enjoy the most, writing articles for different media or writing your own book? And how is the process different? And how different is the writing process for those?
Hmm. Ooh. Uh I would definitely say I enjoy writing my own like sort of passion projects more just because in freelancing I'm always wanting to write more and I usually overwrite and then my editors say dial it down some. And yeah, because you just kind of get to be weirder in how you say things or what you want to mention. I think with freelancing, I do like that it challenges me to generate a lot of new ideas and to kind of work that muscle instead of indulging what I'm naturally aligned with. But the in terms of how the process is different with freelancing, I definitely am a bit quicker. Like I can come up with a pitch idea and kind of bullet point it and know the basic idea of what the pitch is going to be. And then with the writing, I kind of have a process there. But I also have to be more selective and more careful in how I say things. But with like book projects, I love it because it just lets me be like that little kid that wanted to learn calligraphy or wanted to be a spy. It's like you kind of get to be endlessly curious about this big thing that has all these small parts to it. And I also love that, I don't know, when you're really into your own writing, the world just kind of melts away. And I'm like, isn't that meditative or it feels meditative? Yeah, but I definitely like my passion projects more. It's just more, I don't know, I guess it feeds the inner child more.
Yeah, I love that. Next question. I apologize if I say your name incorrectly. But we have Tanira Layton in the Q&A. This person asked, who was the first person you allowed to read your memoir when you were finished? And how did you arrive at how you would publish your book?
Phew. I mean, I think the first person was my agent, to read it all the way through. I'm definitely a writer. I don't really work with beta readers. I don't really have feedback partners. I am more of a writer where if I'm inspired by something I wrote, I want to share it with people and see how it lands or see what the vibe of it is, but I'm not intensely like collaborative or I don't send my work off to people. So the first person was my agent. Um, and then in terms of how I went about getting it published or how I decided, I knew I wanted to get it traditionally published. I mean, I have known about self-publishing and I've learned about it, and I'm definitely not against it in any way, but it's just always been my dream to be traditionally published. And since 2017, I've had a literary agent on and off. Like now I'm on my third literary agent. I think this is the longest one I've ever had. Wow. Oh, yeah. And yeah, and working with an agent, they're typically helping you get traditionally published. And yeah, I mean, I went on submissions for about almost a year and I got a lot of no's. And then me and that agent parted ways. And then I ended up having an editor reach out to me personally about the book. Uh, yeah.
Well, I'll just say, Prince, again, this has been so phenomenal getting to talk to you up close in person, even though we are on Zoom. Can you please let us know, for people who don't know, like where we can find you, maybe give us a website, some of your social media, that way we can kind of keep up with all the great things that are happening in your writing career and follow closely.
Yeah. If folks want to check out more of my work, you can find me on my website, princeshakur.com, PRINCESHAKUR.com. My Instagram is at Sweet Black Prince. And my Twitter is at PR Shakur. My TikTok is at PR Shakur. I have a podcast called The Creative Hour. It's me interviewing other artists. And I also do a newsletter called Millennial Writer Life. And I also do a YouTube channel, talk about my travels, talk about writing, the book publishing process, a lot of different things. So you can find me on all those platforms.
So basically, nobody has an excuse not to know what Prince is up to
Mhm.
because he's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's
Find me on
awesome.
TikTok. Yeah.
Yes. I'm excited too about the newsletter you do. That sounds really cool. And the podcast. I have to definitely check those two out. We did get another
Yeah.
question in the chat though, which I'm curious to hear about because I believe I've heard you talk about this a little bit. But are you working on a new book for the future? Is there anything you can
Yeah.
tell us about
Yeah.
what's
Um,
next?
I'm on draft 9 of a novel. I wrote it in college because if you read my book, you'll read like in high school and college, I wrote like 6 novels because I started writing fiction. But I'm writing a novel. I wrote it in college. I started it again during the lockdown. And it's basically about a Black boy growing up in the Deep South who is investigating his older brother's death. And part of it is in New York, part of it is in jail. And it's set in 1986 and 1987. So I've done a lot of research for it. I'm working hard on it. If there's any editors out there that want to buy it, let me know. Hit me up. But yeah, I'm working on another book, and I have other books in mind. Like I have a collection of essays I want to work on this year. I have maybe 2 other fiction book ideas that I also have rolling around. Also working in the film space. Me and my friend are working on a feature right now, writing or developing like a feature length script idea. So everything and above, I guess.
So while I wait for to see if anyone else in the chat has a question, one that just popped up in my mind, is how do you juggle so many projects as a working writer? That's a lot. And I feel like just with like one or two, I'd be like, okay, I'm tapped out. So like, how do you, juggle so many projects at one time?
Um, I would say with writing, it's definitely I try to switch genres if I get burnt out on one, even if it's just during a single day. I don't know, I mean, it's kind of just case by case. I mean, since I've moved to New York, how I spend my time is a little different. I kind of have to be more serious about certain things. When I was in Ohio, I definitely was still juggling. But I mean, for me, I definitely make myself a lot of to-do lists. I try to stay organized in terms of what my goals are roughly so I can try to hit them. And it's you backlog stuff. So like I work on a lot of YouTube videos for like the next month or two, and then I work on podcast stuff, and you kind of try to plan things out. But it's always a work in progress. And sometimes you have to let one thing fall by the wayside for a while to work on other stuff. And that's also what I do too.
All right. Well, Prince, again, thank you so much. This conversation has been the fuel that I needed to get through, the rest of this week and finish out the summer. Thank you again just for being here, for being you. I'm looking forward to continuing to follow all the great things you do. And I'm just gonna say, like, again, I have my signed copy and your message. I have my like blur on, so you can't even see it. But the message you wrote
Oh,
for me, like, gives me some energy to keep going. So,
good,
thank you for
good.
being you and just for offering all that you do to our writing world.
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions. I appreciate it.
Brandon and Prince, we want to thank you so much for this wonderful discussion tonight. Prince, I really think that readers will really appreciate your vulnerability in this book and inspire young people to be their most authentic selves. So thank you so much for that. Again, thank you so much, Brandon and Prince. We really appreciate your time. And everybody, have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.